So thank you so much, Soccer, for the invitation and the introduction. Thanks to Santiago for, among many other organizational things, this amazing poster, one of my all-time favorites. And thanks to all of you for being here today. I was actually joking with Soccer that it's like a Friday at 5 p.m., it's 85 degrees, that everyone who comes should get a free iPad, but it wasn't in the budget, so maybe next time. But I'm really, well, first of all, I should say, depending on your preferences, you're either about to be sorely disappointed or sorely pleased, because I don't think this is a talk that features poetics or theory. No, it has a little bit of both, but maybe not in the form you're used to in this particular forum. And I just want to say that this is the first time I'm talking about what is a very new project. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity. And I just want to say before I get into it that it's not only a new topic for me, but I'm also writing in a new way. I think as many of you probably know, whatever kinds of writing you're doing, you're sometimes quite exhausted of that genre by the time you're done with a book or a seminar paper or a thesis or a dissertation. And so this book, or this talk, is from a book that is obviously, it's meant to be scholarly, but it's also meant to be entertaining and accessible. And as you'll see today, it has a sort of essayistic and personal bent. And so when we get to Q&A, obviously I'd love to hear your thoughts about content, about argument, about ideas, but I'm also very happy to hear questions and feedback on the style. And I think we solved the tech problem as good as we're gonna get it. Because I can't play the audio from my computer without massive feedback, but it wasn't that important, so I was just going to roll with it. Sure. I think probably at this point we'll just go. But thank you so much. Sorry to bring you out for no problem at all. For me to say no. Thanks. All right. So, all right. With that in mind, I'm just going to get started. All right. Oh, but not that way. So I fell in love with computers because of Barbie. Not the doll, mind you, which never interested me all that much, but the 2D single player Barbie that my father bought for me to play on his Commodore 64. Released in 1984, the game kicks off with a phone call from Ken, who asks the player, Barbie, you have to play as Barbie, you can't play as Ken. So Ken calls and asks the player Barbie on a date. And he says, "Hi, Barbie, this is Ken. Would you like to go to the pool?" Or sometimes he asks Barbie to dinner or to play tennis or for a picnic. Regardless of the invitation, Barbie coos, "Sounds like fun." "Great," Ken replies, and then delivers the news that he'll see you in an hour. An hour? Well, it's time for Barbie to jump into her yellow convertible and hit the town at top speed to find just the right outfit and hairstyle for her date. If you don't pick the right outfit, you wind up back at home where the phone rings again and Ken tells you that plans have changed. If you choose the right getup, then you get to see an image of Barbie and Ken frolicking on their date. So I'm curious if do any of you know this game? Have any of you seen it or played it? Okay, so this is really a kind of like niche relic. But I just want to show you, so this will be with not the best sound quality, but you'll get the idea, what this game looks like in a sort of 2-minute playthrough clip. It's not me playing, by the way. People often want to know.
Hello. Hi, Barbie. It's Ken. Would you like to go to the pool? Sounds like fun. Great. See you in an hour.
So you could change the colors and the patterns, which this player chose not to do, but that was an option. Gotta have flip-flops for the pool.
Hello. Hi, Barbie. Plans have changed. Would you like to go on a picnic? Sounds like fun. Great. See you in an hour.
And it repeats, right? So that was apparently the wrong outfit for the pool. So now it's going to be a picnic. Oops, sorry. So this is if you do pick the right outfit and you win, this is what you're rewarded with, which is just amazing for so many reasons. But I was too young at the time to recognize the game as a sexist abomination. And I just reveled in picking out purple cowboy boots, off-the-shoulder ball gowns, and long flowing hairstyles for my blonde avatar. Suddenly though, one day, true story, the game malfunctioned. None of the correct outfits worked anymore, and winning required outlandish, nonsensical clothing combinations. A parka, bikini bottoms, and stilettos to play tennis, pigtails, and a fur coat for picnic. It was as if some feminist deity had intervened, and I could not have been more delighted. The glitch made the game utterly unpredictable, and to me, tremendously enjoyable. Today, I can see that the malfunction revealed something of the game's absurdity, poking holes into the logic of the correct outfit that Ken would approve. But back then, I was just a girl giggling at a console, wondering what had happened to the game so that yellow ballet slippers with a lavender leotard was the winning combination to wear to prom. Barbie, a toxic game about femininity and dating turned private screwball comedy, was my first computer love. And it's a fitting entry point for my talk today. A pixelated relic from the 1980s that reminds us that the decade's revolution in home computing was bound up with ideas and representations of love and romance. We often imagine computational culture as sterile. We picture men, and almost always men, and always white, punching away at buttons in massive labs, designing intricate chips and coding strings of zeros and ones. We retell the story of the internet's origins in military research, and we try to make sense of disembodied databases and heartless algorithms. But the truth is that the moment computers were invented, and especially at the moment when they were introduced into people's homes, they raised questions and fueled speculations about matters of the heart. My new project, Computer Love, is about the personal computer, arguably the most important artifact of the 1980s, about the narratives it shaped, and about the way that computers and romance have always been intertwined. More narrowly, it is about the fantasies, predictions, hopes, and fears that circulated during the 1980s about computers and how they would change love. Pop culture at the time was filled with images of computer love. Sometimes strange and often silly, these images reveal the historically specific dreams and nightmares that people attached to a new technology. They also tell stories about our age-old desires for connection. Narratives of computer love, in other words, are as much about love as they are about computers. So in my talk today, I want to try to lay out some of this argument, to discuss some of the implications and questions it raises, and then talk through just a few examples that come from the book's first chapter on platonic love, which focuses on friendship between computer users and between people and their PCs. There's such a wealth of interesting material that I'm drawing from for this project. I'm gonna shout out to Ethan Snyder, my research assistant, who has helped me dredge up so many incredible things. Obviously he's not here today, but he certainly deserves a lot of credit. So it was like actually very difficult for me to decide what I was going to share with you today. So I'll just show you this very quickly, which are the other chapters of the book, Platonic Love, as I've mentioned, but Forbidden Love and the libidinal energy that surrounded computers in the 80s. Chapter on romantic love and the by now forgotten computational dating tools that preceded online dating. And on sentient computers attempting to romance humans and other computers. All of these chapters use personal essay, archival research, and scholarly argument to recover a way of thinking about intimacy during the time of computers mainstreaming. But today I'll be focusing on, as I said, philia, and on some popular movies that I think will likely be familiar to most of you. Okay, but first let me say just a little bit about the core arguments of this project. So the intense feelings that swirled around PCs in the 1980s have, I think, not only been largely forgotten, but it's my sense that it's love itself that keeps this chapter in our material and cultural history of computers dormant and out of fashion. It's a truism to say that we currently live in a climate of computer addiction, physically and mentally dependent on computers, unable to moderate our use without suffering withdrawal. Privately and publicly, in person and online, we lament the damage that our devices are doing to our sleep, our social skills, our work-life balance, our politics, our posture. These complaints, however, are not really usually about computers. They're about the things we do with them, and more specifically about the internet. When my students admit that their attention spans have been whittled down by TikTok and their confidence diminished by Instagram, or when pundits try to make sense of alt-right message boards and trolling tactics. The object of critique is rarely, if ever, the device, but the internet, what Gia Tolentino calls a feverish, electric, unlivable hell. I think one reason we rarely talk about love when we talk about the PC revolution of the 1980s is largely because we are now caught up in these debates about whether the social media streams and digital flows in our contemporary devices are making us lonely. So ironically, as computers have become ubiquitous, they have receded from view. We discuss the internet ad nauseum, but seldom think about the device, unless there's a new product to reckon with. So when Apple drops a new iPhone or Google Glass is hyped and then abandoned, the physicality of tech is often an afterthought. But in the 1980s, as personal computers became commercially available and made their way into homes and offices, their materiality was paramount. Computer love, in addition to naming an attitude or an orientation, also describes the very embodied relations people had with their glowing consoles and purring hard drives. And I try to keep this in mind throughout my analysis, and you'll see some of that when I talk through some examples. But the point is that in the 1980s, the computer itself was an exciting new love object, a shiny new toy, a portal to other dimensions, a potentially autonomous creature, often more pet than appliance. In 1977, a Commodore executive even named the company's new computer a PET, inspired by the pet rock and backronymed to personal electronic transactor. In Track Changes, a literary history of word processing, which is a rare study that does really attend to the physicality of digital technology, Matthew Kirschenbaum describes typing. And he says, a writer presses a key and completed a circuit, and a spark of voltage flashes through a silicon chip to open a logic gate that illuminates a pattern of pixels on a liquid crystal display screen. This description makes it clear that this, as Kirschenbaum notes, is a material act, and in that material act lives history. Other scholars have written material histories of the personal computer. Paul Ceruzzi's A History of Modern Computing will tell you everything you want to know about the technological and corporate developments that led to smaller, cheaper, widely available PCs. Michael Sean Mahoney's History of Computing constructs a detailed timeline of the changes in software that accompanied the computer's rise. But while these studies of chips and processors narrate material histories, they don't tell us the human histories those materials make possible. What relationships did people have to these new alien objects? How did computers reorient people's bodies, homes, and desires? To answer these questions and to figure out how we got from an era of computer love to today requires attention to computers themselves. But it also, I would argue, requires attention to the stories that circulated about computers. The movies, television shows and commercials, music, literature, and newspaper stories of the 1980s are saturated with a collective excitement about computers. Attention to these stories reveals the intensity of feelings that surrounded them. The maelstrom of love, desire, affection, hope, longing, and yes, also envy, resentment, and fear that swirled around IBMs and Apples. These feelings have been as important as feats of engineering in our computational history. Any history that does not recognize the pleasures of technology and the profound attachment people form to it remains woefully incomplete. But studies of computers often lead away from pleasure, instead veering towards sterile technological accounts or philosophical musings about the ontologies and epistemologies they have birthed. Because the computer is often framed as the brainchild of scientific labs and military think tanks, all binary code and dispassionate hardware, it can be easy to forget just how fun and even sexy computers were when they first hit the mainstream. Foregrounding pleasure requires looking around and aside empirical facts and grand theories, focusing instead on the idiosyncratic, the everyday, and the popular. Making the case for the serious study of so-called guilty pleasures, Ariel Zibrak notes that if ship manifests and medical records and military logs and patent files are the kinds of documents that reveal the history of our migrations, conflicts, and technologies, popular fictions are the kinds of documents that tell us about the history of our hearts and minds. I am interested in that history of hearts and minds, but maintain that our bodies are always a part of the equation. Using computers is an embodied act, one that has influenced our expectations and desires in very physical ways. This is why chronicling computer love is, among other things, a study in material culture, an investigation of the culture that sprung up around the new artifact of the PC. It's also a feminist approach to a topic and a discipline dominated by men and stories about them. As Joy Lacey Rankin writes in A People's History of Computing in the United States, the history of computing and networking has been dominated by a great white men's storyline. What she calls the Silicon Valley mythology maintains that the information age had founding fathers, men including Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg. According to this origin story, there were no computers for ordinary people, no personal computing, until those founding fathers and their hardware and software made computing accessible to everyone, end quote. But in the pop culture narratives and artifacts that interest me, there are very few great men. Instead, there are curious boys, the dreamy girls they hope to impress, beleaguered parents, lonely nerds, and outcasts of all sorts, as well as the occasional alien, and we'll get to them. In short, I don't want to offer a history of technology, but rather a history of people's feelings about technology. I want to recover a way of thinking about intimacy and the computer during the time of the PC's mainstreaming that is accurate. One thing that I've found very difficult is to figure out how to ensure that this isn't just an exercise in nostalgia or some kind of counterfactual narrative, like what might have been. And instead to think about what would it mean to imagine, or is it even possible to imagine a different path out of the 80s? Would it prevent internet addiction? Would it kill online trolls before they were born? What kind of exercise is that? Certainly at times I engage in both those modes of nostalgia or counterfactual thinking because it is very fun to revel in the retro zaniness of the 80s and to explore the speculations about what might have been. But first and foremost, I'm trying to recover what I think has been lost to history and to explain why the reality of computer love has been so soon forgotten in both scholarship and public thought. You mentioned it, Tucker, so good thing I had the slide. Of course, 80s pop culture, I would say even more than our own today, frequently ignored the very real conditions of its time. Corny rom-coms like Electric Dreams, Greg's favorite, and upbeat bops like Kraftwerk's Computerliebe or Computer Love present a zany utopian pop dream that seems to exist in a vacuum, sealed off from the decade's crack epidemic, ruthless gentrification, broken windows policing, and AIDS crisis. Computer love, in fact, often feels like an escapist fantasy meant to divert attention from the structural inequalities of the decade, as if a pixelated future or a companionable computer might save us from present cruelties. But even if the decade's love affair with computers created sometimes apolitical fantasies meant to obscure real socio-political conditions, the romance of computers was real and formative for many people. Embodied experiences of love are always bound up with material conditions, just to stress that again. And so my point here is that even though critique plays an essential role in the dismantling of racist patriarchal structures, so too does pleasure. It's important to take seriously the everyday intimacies that bring people joy, the technologies that satisfy desires and create new ones. Computers didn't always feel as dehumanizing as they do right now. And computer love describes a time when, in fact, they felt humanizing. So I'm interested, as I said, in what revisiting this time can tell us about how we might learn to create better tools or do better with them. That's a kind of big hope, but it's something that's very much on my mind as I look at these interesting artifacts. Okay, so in this section, I want to give just a bit of background that's relevant to the analysis I'll end with today. And some of you will be very familiar with this history, but it's important to what I think is happening in the texts I'm going to talk about. Now, there are indeed some dystopian stories about computers from the 80s, but the vast majority of the decade's texts are exuberant, optimistic, urging viewers, readers, and consumers to feel the computer love. While it's tempting to cast such narratives as mere marketing, as in, this computer is going to make you feel good, go out and buy one. The excitement around computers legible in the decade's fiction, that excitement seems genuine, not least because the advent of PCs seemed at first to herald a shift in power away from the man and toward the everyman, or in the case of the movies I'll talk about today, the every teen. As Kevin Driscoll describes in Modem World, his account of BBSs or bulletin board systems, the 80s were a decade of computational optimism. Driscoll notes that the PC's individual scale and single user accessibility felt liberating, a chance for average people to tap into processing power and connectivity that until then had been the exclusive territory of governments and corporations. In the 1980s, he writes, the personal computer was sold as a tool to empower individuals, foster creativity, and increase productivity. Efforts to create better tools and hobbyists motivated by love are in fact what brought the PC into being. Top-down innovations in the mid and late 1970s initiated the shift from mainframes to personal computers. The development of powerful microprocessors and capacious memory chips made product releases by Altair, IBM, Radio Shack, and Apple possible. But it was the zeal of the hobbyist community that set personal computers rocketing toward mainstream appeal and usage. A large group of hobbyists across the United States supplied a key component in creating the personal computer. They provided an infrastructure of support that neither the computer companies nor the chip makers could. This community, born out of the radio amateurs who had opened up the high-frequency radio spectrum after World War I, developed its tinkering talents to include high-fidelity music reproduction, automatic controls, basic robotics, and eventually digital applications in computing. In 1974, Radio Electronics announced a kit that would allow those who purchased it to build the Mark 8, your personal mini computer. And in 1975, the Altair home computer hit the market. The computer kit, which was a CPU, memory card, and a newly designed bus, was shipped for $400, which is the equivalent of a little more than $2,000 today. So it wasn't inexpensive then either. But because the specifications of the Altair were not kept as a company secret, users could design and market their own RAM cards. It was up to the consumer to put it together, make it work, and write any needed software. So while it was true that for $400, hobbyists got minimal equipment and an uneasy task, the computer was expandable and it was available. As hobbyists tinkering pushed along the Mark 8 and Altair, Commodore International, IBM, and Apple worked furiously to draw upon these decentralized advancements and launch their own personal computer. In 1975, IBM introduced the Model 5100. In 1977, Radio Shack began offering its TRS-80 in stores, and that same year, in 1977, both the Apple II and the Commodore PET became available. Like the Altair, the Apple II had a control bus with slots for expansion. Until the mid-80s, this kind of open architecture was the norm for personal computers, so that even as more non-hobbyists purchased PCs, adding, upgrading, and swapping components with other computers was relatively easy. The computer that ushered in the decade of computer love debuted on August 12, 1981. The IBM 5150, developed in just 12 short months of revision to earlier models, hit the market with a campaign of television and print ads featuring Charlie Chaplin's character, the Little Tramp. The commercials featuring the lovable, bumbling tramp and punning statements such as, with this tool for modern times, a person can quickly master such jobs as accounting or word processing, were designed to make the IBM PC approachable, a friendly, cozy gadget rather than an alien machine. The ads seemed to work and people fell in love with the computer. Sales exceeded IBM's predictions by 800% and PC became a household name. Shortly after the IBM PC was released in January 1983, Time magazine replaced their annual Man of the Year with the Machine of the Year, showcasing the personal computer on its cover. And actually it was just, I think, 2 years ago where Time magazine then did the Man of the Year was you, and the surface of the cover was reflective as a mirror, and it was all about sort of what we now do on computers and curate ourselves on Instagram and so on and so forth. So that's a sort of interesting arc that I've been thinking about too. All right, so it's important to remember that even as PCs flooded the market in people's homes, for many people, it was still a slightly alien entity, a chunky cube whose potential uses and pitfalls were not entirely understood. The home computer was a strange and alluring object, a mysterious box containing titillatingly named hardware and software. But by 1989, according to the US Census, 15% of all US households reported that they had a computer, a number that seems small today, but represented a huge jump from the 8% reported in 1984. In 1984, IBM's revenue from the PC market was $4 billion, more than twice that of Apple. Although Apple began its ascent halfway through the decade, it's worth recalling that most people who met the PC for the first time in the 80s would have greeted a Commodore or an IBM. My own story begins with both. I was born one day before the IBM 5150 was released, And many of my earliest memories feature the Commodore 64 and the IBM 5150 that lived in my father's home office. This matters not only because the type of device determined the programs they ran, games they played, and networks they accessed, but because it shaped the general orientation toward computers as open rather than closed devices. So during the 1980s, especially the first half of the decade, computers were simultaneously the height of technology and unfinished business. It can be hard to recall this fact, especially now that our devices are by and large black boxes, deftly diagnosed by Alexander Galloway when he writes, "Today the black box is connected to the things around it, but its external connectivity is heavily managed. It is still a cloaked node, only now it is covered in symbolic skin." It was not until the late 80s and early 90s, when Apple's Macintosh began to corner the market, that closed black box computers became mainstream. Elegant system software was the Mac's selling point, but also what made it resistant to tinkering. And the interactive, upgradable nature of early PCs, I think, in fact, contributed to the appeal of computers as technological wonders. A computer might talk to you or run complex equations, but it could also be opened up and adapted. While the ubiquity of television had accustomed people to having screens in their homes, computers' early adjustability gave them the air of high-tech cars, ready to be hacked and honed in the garage, albeit by nerds like my dad instead of the stereotypically muscle-bound gearhead. Don't tell my dad that I even said that. He'd be like, I worked on cars too. But of course, while the car was mechanical, the computer was digital. Even the coders and hobbyists who could program the PC couldn't quite see their code working in the same way that someone who replaced the spark plugs in their Ford Thunderbird would when the ignition sparked when the car started. Computers allowed for input, but then performed operations that remained mysterious to many users, bringing a kind of technical alchemy into offices, dens, and bedrooms around the world. This particular cocktail of tinkering, adaptability, mystery, and allure informs some of the biggest movies from the 80s. Not just the biggest computer movies, but the biggest movies from the decade period. If you watch the decade's blockbuster movies about computers without any context, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the technology was designed exclusively for children, more specifically for white boys between the ages of 10 and 15. In fact, you could write your own 80s screenplay by using the following formula. 2 to 3 early adolescent boys, friends and or frenemies with video gaming skills and that kind of hobbyist interest in computers I've been talking about. Well, they stumble upon a technological loophole that gives them the ability to control the military, go to outer space, or create new life forms. Shenanigans and battles occur before the boys are triumphant and order is restored. Follow this formula and you have the plot of several of the decade's most successful films. War Games from 1983, Explorers from 1985, The Last Starfighter from 1984, and Weird Science from 1985. Initially, this isn't very surprising. Boys were the primary consumers of video and arcade games, and so it seemed a logical step that they would transfer their attention from gaming consoles to computer monitors. And of course, the astronomical success of Steven Spielberg's movie E.T., the Extraterrestrial, motivated countless producers and directors to try out their own version of a boy meets alien story. So, although E.T., and here I mean, E.T. the creature, not the movie, but E.T. the creature was no computer, but his boxy gray body and luminous screen-like eyes evoked the PC, another two-lettered alien who showed up in suburban homes and was quickly beloved by children. It's not hard then to draw the line from E.T.'s depiction of the government as faceless menace seeking to apprehend the innocent alien and his grade school friend Elliot, to the films in which boys use the PC to hack into powers reserved for grown-ups and governments. E.T.'s commercial success in cinemas and in merchandising can also explain why so many 1980s films about computers feature puppets. Yes, puppets. This was a moment when I thought I've reached the point in my career where now I give talks about puppets. But so even the 80s movies that include experimental, state-of-the-art computerized graphics often culminate with scenes of creatures who ooze, splash, and waddle their way on screen. So the computer-created super babe Lisa transforms the loathsome older brother Chet into a blob at the end of Weird Science from 1985. That's Chet, I guess, on your left. And the trio of space-exploring boys and explorers meet green, tentacled Whack and Meek after they discover that a modem can launch them into other dimensions. The sudden appearance of puppets in these films reminds us that the 80s was also a heyday of puppeteering. Following on the heels of Jim Henson's success with his first 3 Muppet movies, those are 1979, 81, and 84. Following the success of those films, producers were eager to put lovable and loathsome creatures on screen to appeal to movie-going children and their parents. So that includes things like The Dark Crystal from 1982, The Never-Ending Story from 84, Ghostbusters, also 84, Gremlins, also 84, The Goonies, 1985, and Labyrinth, 1986. All of those films tapped into the zeitgeist, giving us a menagerie of memorable, webbed, slimy, and furry characters. These creatures were themselves at the time a new technology, like the PC, and both shaped the decade's obsession with humanoid and human-adjacent beings. Although at first glance, Gizmo from Gremlins may seem worlds away from the Commodore 64, intermediaries like the murderous HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey, or charming R2-D2 from Star Wars suggest that the only thing separating them is a thin layer of fur. It's no accident that so many of the decade's stories of computers are creature features. They highlight the fixation on the animacy and agency of the machines settling into homes across the country. Watching a movie like The Explorers today, it can be difficult to square what now looks like quaint or clumsy special effects and puppets with what was, in 1985, a treatment of the latest technology. Seen in the film's story about computers, but also in its special effects. Who has seen Explorers? Okay, who has seen War Games? A few more. Okay, so no one. All right, so I'm going to talk about both those movies a little bit. Okay, so let's see. Explorers. So this is a science fantasy film, is what they bill this genre as, science fantasy, and it stars teenagers Ethan Hawke and River Phoenix, both in their film debuts, as boys who use PC components to build a spacecraft that powers them into the galaxy. Shortly after breaking Earth's orbit, something overrides their spaceship's PC controls, and their spaceship is called Thunder Road, after the Bruce Springsteen song. Something overrides their ship's controls, and they're beamed light years away into deep space, and then tractor beamed aboard a much larger spaceship. Venturing out to meet their captors, the boys encounter Whack and Meek, 2 zany and lovable aliens whose knowledge of Earth comes entirely from television reruns. Okay, so what does this movie, which was a flop in theaters, due in part to the fact that it came out at the same time as Back to the Future, another computer film in many ways. It was a flop in theaters, but it's gained a cult following after it was released on VHS. But what does it tell us about computers? Most obviously, the film plugs straight into the technological nexus of the 1980s that seemed poised to make science fiction a reality. Computers were so high-tech that surely amateur space travel and the discovery of alien life forms were closer at hand than ever. The aliens themselves are also like computers. They are foreign entities who aggregate and spit out data. In this case, their speech is entirely composed of television and movie clips. So they have clips from monster movies, they have the mannerisms of television's personalities, and one of them gives a memorable performance of a Little Richard song. It's a very strange sequence in this film. But so as it turns out, they are also like the boys who have come to visit them. A plot twist reveals that Whack and Meek are only children, young teens themselves who have dreamt about meeting the humans they've seen on TV, and their dad comes and busts them with his even bigger spaceship. That's how they learn that they're just kids too. So this is a movie that is as much about youth as it is about space exploration. In fact, it's a film about the relationship between youth and computers. It's no accident that the explorers' heroes and computer wizards are young boys. One might expect to find an antagonism between young people and computers in 80s films, a showdown between innocence and play on the one side and dangerous, rational technology on the other. But more often, as in The Explorers, 80s movies insist that young people possess a particular blend of innocence and precociousness that makes them heroic computer users. I call this computational innocence, and it was a major trope in the 80s. A 1984 New York Magazine profile of people living with the computer discusses advertisements using computational innocence to sell PCs. It mentions, quote, a current TV commercial that shows a young girl leading her father by the hand into a computer store, end quote. Many ads depicted similar scenes in efforts to demystify computers and make them less intimidating. The commercials also seemed aimed at prompting parents to buy computers so that they could keep up with their own children. This was sort of a meme a few years ago where there would be like 4-year-olds explaining how to use Google or how to use different internet functions. So it's a trope that you see in really heavy-handed ways here that I think also continues in a sort of different form now. But young people at the time were seen as especially adept at figuring out computers. And I think this does intersect with the fact that computers were not yet seen as machines fully under corporate or government control. Movies like The Explorers, War Games, and The Last Starfighter stress this fact, using the figure of the boy hacker, tinkerer, and gamer as a force who could still interrupt greater powers attempting to use computers for malevolent aims. In The Explorers, for instance, the local police are no match for the boys' computing know-how. Audiences root for the young heroes to win out against the police, the military, and the government, because the movies suggest that their hearts and motives are pure. It's unclear, though, in most of these movies, what the boy protagonists will do if they actually succeed. Will they topple a regime? Will they stop the military from using computers for warfare? Will they spread knowledge of extraterrestrial life back to Earth? Or will the boys grow out of their innocence and turn into the authorities they evade, just with more computational savvy? That last one was a bet made by the Reagan administration in the 80s, who saw youth interest in video games and computers as a potential boon for the US Armed Forces. In 1983, during a visit to Walt Disney World's Epcot Center, then President Reagan addressed outstanding math and science students from Central Florida. His remarks directly linked computational play with military prowess. So in the speech, he said, young people have developed incredible hand, eye, and brain coordination in playing these games. The Air Force believes these kids will be outstanding pilots should they fly our jets. The computerized radar screen in the cockpit is not unlike the computerized video screen. Watch a 12-year-old take evasive action and score multiple hits while playing Space Invaders, and you will appreciate the skills of tomorrow's pilot. What I am saying is that right now, you're being prepared for tomorrow. This speech, given the same year that War Games hit theaters, captures the explicit link between youth, computers, and the military that drove much of the decade's popular culture. Reaganism abetted what a Wired magazine story famously called the military entertainment complex in 1993. We know, of course, that the creation of the digital computer itself was an enormously subsidized affair, pursued in the interest of maintaining and strengthening American military dominance. In the 1980s, the Department of Defense became the largest underwriter of the development of computer graphics technologies. But despite all of this context, watching these films does not feel like an exercise in propaganda or covert training. I mean, that doesn't look like covert training to me. Maybe I'm wrong. I would be curious to hear your thoughts. But the computational innocence at the heart of these stories is sincere. Even if the films tap into a shared uncertainty about computers and what they will make possible, they land on the side of optimism. And that is the side of both children and creatures, whose innocence ensures that their computer savvy will be used for good. Intergalactic friendship, the end of the Cold War, and of course, romance with a popular girl. Because we didn't yet know how PCs could change education, leisure time, communication, or even brain chemistry, all things seemed possible. Would children playing the popular 1987 Commodore 64 game Canyon become expert fighter pilots? Or would fans of the Commodore's shoot-em-ups like Delta and Katakis turn calloused and violent? The 1983 movie War Games poses such questions against the historical backdrop of the Cold War. War Games, a critical and commercial success at the time of its release and now a classic, stars Matthew Broderick playing David Lightman, a bright but unmotivated high school student in Seattle. We first see David in an arcade playing Galaga, an introduction that is meant to establish him simultaneously as a troublemaker or slacker and a computer whiz. David uses his microcomputer, an IMSI 8080, to access the school district's computer system and change his grades, as well as the grades of his romantic interest, Jennifer Mack. Later, While war dialing numbers in Sunnyvale, California to find a computer game company, he connects accidentally with a system that turns out to be the War Operation Plan Response System, or WOPR. And he unknowingly initiates a game of global thermonuclear war. David plays as the Soviet Union and begins targeting American cities. When the computer starts a simulation and convinces NORAD that Soviet missiles are inbound, it appears as if World War III is in fact imminent. In the end, of course, David saves the day. After authorities are unable to stop the computer from continuing the simulation, he directs the computer to play tic-tac-toe against itself, forcing it to learn the concept of no-win scenarios. WOPR cycles through all the nuclear war scenarios it has devised and discovers they all result in draws. The concept of mutual assured destruction, keep saying win or none as it goes through all these cycles, that concept of mutual assured destruction taught to WOPR by a simple act of programming tic-tac-toe leads WOPR to conclude that nuclear war is a strange game in which the only winning move is not to play. This concluding fantasy that WOPR can be trained and transformed through a game of tic-tac-toe bespeaks an anxiety about computers' complexity and is a prime example of the film's investment in computational innocence. We have David, a bad kid who is a good person, using his computer savvy to thwart a computer designed to protect the nation that instead endangers it. The movie mobilizes Cold War fears only to assuage them. The question of who or what should manage nuclear war is proven to be nonsense because such a war is a zero-sum game. Instead of conflict that kills masses of innocent people, the film asks us to imagine a future shaped by idealistic innocence interested in computers. Make games, not war. But what War Games insists upon, even through the enjambment of its title, is that by 1983, computers were blurring the line between games and war to an alarming degree. This wasn't the only line blurred. In a segment on July 13th, 1983, NBC described war games as having scary authenticity. This fear, similar to the kind that sprung up around the 1938 War of the Worlds radio drama, galvanized congressional hearings about regulating computers. In this sense, war games not only served as a framework for the first widespread public discussion of computer networking, it also generated policy around networking itself. Of course, simulation has long been a crucial part of military preparation. Think of the scenes from movies depicting a lieutenant standing over a tabletop map in a rudimentary battlefield tent, moving pieces across the board to represent possible maneuvers. As computers, which had already been integrated into government and military systems, entered American homes, the boundaries between personal play and state operations seemed increasingly porous. If the military was using computers to automate its attacks and its defensive actions, what would stop the young Matthew Brodders of the world from intervening? War Games depicts the Cold War as a series of moves managed by a computer at a time when warfare itself was becoming more virtual. And as Reagan's speech and the growing use of computer and video games in military training made clear, simulation was becoming something else, something more real. The more that flying a fighter jet became a matter of operating computers and digital tools, the more that experience could, theoretically, be recreated through a computer simulation. Both elements of this logic, that war was becoming a kind of computerized game, and that the young people excelling at computerized games would therefore be proficient at war, are on display in many 80s movies. However, computational innocence skewers that proficiency. The young protagonists of these films are heroes because they work against the system. Their rebellious spirits not yet fully channeled into entrepreneurial energies or tech productivity. This emphasis on play and playfulness in war games and other 80s movies is a hallmark of the genre and of one kind of computer love. These movies remind us of this kind of platonic, affectionate computer love. This love between friends and fellow voyagers is playful and sweet. It proceeds without a motive and without a clear outcome in mind, and so is often figured as anti-authoritarian. We loved our computers like we loved ET. We didn't imagine they would hurt us, but instead that they would empower us, help us defeat bullies, even the governmental or intergalactic kind. And they would help us defeat bullies even if those bullies also used computers. This is all a far cry from the figure of the young male computer prodigy that remains potent in our contemporary culture. from Mark Zuckerberg to Elon Musk to Vitalik Buterin and other crypto bros. The gap between 1980s computational innocence and today's sinister icons of computer know-how illuminates how much has changed in 40 years, not just in computing technology, but in what we expect from it. The hopeful visions from the 80s seem naive now, given our contemporary knowledge about computer addiction, broken attention spans, and omnipotent algorithms. But I think these visions are also remarkable. My wager is that revisiting the 80s and the stories about computers it gave us can remind us that we collectively imagined many different outcomes for this technology, and so may inspire us, even in some small way, to dream and fantasize anew. I believe that we are destined to the negative outcomes we foresee and fear unless we can imagine around and beyond the pessimism that drives so much public discourse. Computational innocence and the platonic love in the stories I've talked about today remind us of the urgency in fighting corporate takeover of our new technologies. And more broadly, remembering and revisiting computer love asks us to take seriously the ways that computers might still facilitate connection and community, the things we might still learn from our machines and devices about human love. Or to me, at least, as Barbie would say, sounds like fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for that stimulating talk. If there are questions, we can open the floor. There's a lot to think about and think with. Maybe I'll kick it out while people are gathering their thoughts. I have two sort of broad questions. One was about the gesture, the underlying gesture to not fall into the movement of critique, which you do go through when you're talking about the economic, military, racialized undertones of all of this, and how it continues to intensify towards something like, and that's the moment I'm trying to recall. What exactly is it? Is it hope? Is it an alternative future? Is it an alternative relation to the present? So I just wanted to hear more about that gesture or that shift, which I think is also kind of meta-critical. And then the other thing was perhaps just, I mean, the title says more, and we talk more about the love towards computers, and here we got a version of platonic friendship. But could you say something about the other parts of the project? So, and perhaps that's a bit unfair since it's ongoing, but how does this link to say 2 and 3 especially?
Yeah, thank you so much. So the first question, if not critique, then what? So the first answer I have to that is very flat-footed and relatively uninteresting, which is a history. I mean, it just really feels that, and of course, I think that how you stand in relation to what I'm about to say probably does depend on your age, your relationship to computers, where you grew up, how you were exposed to computers, how you feel about them now. But I do feel like I haven't read, we read how many thought pieces have we read in the last month on ChatGPT alone? And it feels like a lot of the discourse is still informed by a very dystopic version from, say, like the Terminator or one piece of war games and not the rest. And I am just very struck by the fact that so many people that you talk to, when you talk to about, especially if they had a relationship with computers in the 80s, that they didn't feel that way, that they really felt a kind of love and joy. And I created this mass anonymous online survey where people could write in their first memories of computers. And it won't surprise you just because of my own age that most of these people had their first experience with a computer as children, so that might shape it, or as young people in the 80s, and that it was really an experience of love and joy and exuberance. And I think we don't talk about that. And part of me just feels like that's a real gap in the kinds of histories that we're telling, both about the technology and about people's own orientation to computers and devices and the internet today. That so much of the fear and frustration also comes from the letdown, maybe in part, of what was possible, or what they imagined would be possible, or the affective relationship that they had at some other time. And so it just seems to me, you know, a little bit historically negligent to be spilling so much ink about computers and how awful they are, and to have silenced this chapter of that history. But that was a sort of flat-footed answer about history. And I would just say quickly before I take the other question that you asked, I really do think that part of what I've been feeling lately is that we in the humanities in particular have different stories to tell about computing and computers. And in part, it's the stories about the stories, right? I mean, I went through some of that basic history to set the stage, but that there are so many narratives that were huge juggernauts, huge commercial successes. And of course, we write off a lot of pop culture and say like, well, that was mainstream, it was propagandistic in this way, or it was, you know, assimilated by the nefarious forces of capitalism. And I think that we actually have a skill set of literary, filmic, linguistic, semiotic analysis that gets at so many different angles that are equally important around computers and their history. And I don't think that those are necessarily the voices that are loudest in public debates about computers. And I mean, I understand very well why, but so part of it is a kind of attempt on my part to figure out, what do I, as someone trained in contemporary literary studies or 20th century literary studies and material culture, have to say about computers? And it's about their stories. But the something else, the if hope, and as I said, as you heard at the beginning, you know, I'm actually still trying to figure out, this is the one thing, the piece that I am really having trouble putting into place in a way beyond those two things I said, is like, okay, so what is this nostalgic? Is this counterfactual? And so in the chapters here, so not talking about platonic love, but forbidden love is, I became very interested in all of the ways in which 80s movies about computers use computers to get around a certain kind of 80s moralism, and computers become really strange objects of desire. There's all kinds of sort of queer relationships between computers and people, between computers and computers. And so that chapter is in large part thinking about that. And that has a link to computer love too, which is the sort of sentient computers. And actually, I've been trying to figure out the name of the last chapter, because that chapter is in large part, I think, about how people thought computers would teach us to be, they were like Cyrano de Bergerac, like they were going to teach us to be better lovers or better romancers. And there's a lot of that that's very interesting, where computers as coach or counsel for love. And the romantic love also has a, you know, I talk more about music in that chapter, but also about this kind of prehistory. I remember when I started thinking about this book, and one of my colleagues said, oh, so you're going to be the online dating professor. And I was like, no, I'm not going to be the online dating professor. But when I started looking through some archival things, it's so fascinating what was out there in the 80s, and even in the late 70s, where dating was sort of computized, but not digitized. So you would send in from, you know, you would cut out a thing from a magazine or a newspaper, and you would write in your preferences for a romantic partner, and then you would send it back in, and they would run that through a computer. And then you would get a result, would be maybe 2 names with a phone number. And I read that and I think that sounds terrifying, but it's really interesting how that got celebrated in the 80s, especially for people who were neurodivergent or had disabilities, it was going to be the kind of future of dating for people who didn't want to go to the bar or to the mixer. And so I'm thinking about that in those chapters. I don't know if that really answered your second question, but I feel like you asked a question about relationship.
I just have a sense of which direction you were going, because they're suggested.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Doug.
Hi, Sarah. So this might be more of a comment that comes from my field discussion, but as Sarah's tracing out how the 1980s has a kind of love relationships and computation that's really centered around white boys in the US. I'm wondering where you situate the kinds of relations that are from other sorts of electronic media. And so I'm thinking about like what keeps me tethered to this thing, which for some people now is like stocks, exchange, or work. but at the same time, it's also music and video games. And so I'm thinking of the 1980s, the time when the TR-808 also comes out, and that gives access to a certain kind of Black music making. That's the genealogy of Afrofuturism. But I'm also thinking of the 1980s and like those furry things of the predecessor to furries, Bandai, like Animal Crossing, and Pokemon,
Yeah.
and that sort of landscape of innocence, which is also racial. I was just wondering how you think about the ways that the genealogy of love and technology you trace is situated racially and geographically, and what it means to imagine that in a broader global context.
Yeah, those are great questions. I haven't thought about the Furbies and the Animal Crossing in the particular lens that you're talking about, but it's funny because before we got started, Professor Gilman was saying that one of her colleagues is related to the Roger, like the person who wrote Computer Love, which is a song by Zach. And it's a kind of electro-funk. It's a great, I love it. I think it's a great track. I think it actually does a lot of things that Kraftwerk can't do around computers, which is to get at a kind of sensuality, but also just like if you were looking for who predicted, who got it right, who wore it best, like who was closer to what online dating would be like. I actually think Zach is more predictably accurate. That's sort of a side note. But so for me, where I've been thinking most about the things that you're talking about are first in music, but I hadn't been thinking about it. And so I appreciate the way that you're saying, what about the technology itself, whether that's the boombox, the boombox with the record function, the 8-track, different things like that, that would be a kind of adjacent angle or an adjacent technology to think about this. But I've been thinking about your questions through music, but what I wanted to say, and that was at the beginning, is I do have trouble because I think the most popular sort of movies and television shows and print ads and text are this sort of, they do often feel, and that's what I was saying at the beginning, as a kind of utopian, evasive maneuver from what was actually happening in the world and politically, not even globally, but just in this country. And so it is difficult to sort of talk about the things that I do find hopeful and optimistic, while also always keeping that in mind, right? Hopeful for whom, optimistic for whom, or optimistic because of an evasion and elision of what. And the other thing that I really don't know about, so again, something you would maybe know more, you can tell me about sometime, is one thing that's not in this project right now is art making. So there's popular culture in all of these ways, but I'm not talking about, say, video art or painting or mixed media art. And I do think that there's so much happening there in the same way that 80s musicians were incorporating the computer via synth and different technological innovations. I'm sure that in the art world, there's a whole different way in which computers present themselves that I just don't really know about. You can fill me in.
I'm trying to listen to your questions, but I feel like one of the examples that you used today, one of several sort of crossing anxieties has to do with, I mean, you mentioned Reagan basically telling us what, the toy can become a tool, right? Like, I mean, all those kids are playing with this, and we can use these skills to kill people, basically. But the movie sort of seems to suggest that a real like state anxiety is that the tool might become a toy or like a your toy. Like more games, and there's something about that also makes me think of there was a whole era where they had all the chess masters playing against computers, winning and not winning, with sort of the idea that maybe one day like the tools just make the game obsolete, right? Like there would be any reason to play. And it's not really a question, but just curious that if you see this as the line to me also reminds me of the 18th century automatons, right? Like same thing with chess, that's just but that seems to go like connect to your idea about innocence around play as opposed to maybe use, I guess.
It's always chess, isn't it, too? But I mean, what I was also thinking of, and this won't answer your question, but just as a kind of preliminary aside or something, is that turning the toy back into the tool is precisely the anxiety, or not precisely, one of the anxieties around ChatGPT right now, right? Like, oh, it was funny when we were like, give me a talk for NYU in the style of, you know, Lady Gaga song. And, you know, then 2 seconds later, it was like the mass panic about exploitation, deep fakes, you know, losing jobs, all these things. And so it's just another sort of pin I'm putting in for myself in my own brain about where these things connect to the contemporary. But chess and games, yeah. So part of what I think is, and that Galaga shot at the beginning of War Games is so striking to me, or if you've seen The Last Starfighter, I mean, it's all like but you know, it's all about an arcade game. But I think it is just the case that it's just true that people, certain people, certain boys in particular, were gaming on computers before they were doing anything else. I mean, I was too, right? That was the Barbie example that I led with. I feel like we should bring, oops, not this, sorry, but we should bring Ken in particular. I just love the way his face is drawn in his tiny shorts here. Barbie at least gets to be a little more proportional, but so I think that, you know, there's also just the very simple historical fact that people were gaming, and the people who were gaming understood something about computers that other people didn't. And there were two sides of the anxiety coin. So I remember, I mean, my brother was the real gamer in our household, and people would say to my father, like, how can you let him play that many games, that many computer games, that many video games, that many arcade games? And, you know, he was always, I mean, didn't like Reagan, but he sort of used that same logic to say, like, no, it's teaching him important things. Like, he'll be able to learn whatever it is, Latin or how to repair a car, if he can play these games and get this hand-eye coordination, all these justifications. And part of what feels really hard about writing this section in particular is that those things are so fused together. Like, in the same moment when these are going to be dangerous, or these are going to turn our children into effective military fighters, or it's going to rot their brain. Or in the 80s, there's a huge body of newspaper and magazine articles about how the arcade is like a really unsafe space for young boys sexually, right? And so there's all this moral panic around what computers would do to young people. But then in the pop culture, that's not really what's at the heart of the movies. I mean, it's around the edges, and it kind of informs the frame, but it's never where the movies end up. And I do think that that's important, but also that it relates to the experience that many people did have with computers in the 80s, which was not, you know, moral panic, but was a kind of like electronic hearth. And it was pleasant and it was fun. So maybe I'm just sort of rambling, but saying that both of the things you're talking about, like toy to tool and tool to toy, and the anxieties that are on both sides of that equation feel present in everything I'm looking at. And sometimes that's why I have a hard time putting my finger on what the message is. It's almost easier to figure out what the mood is than the message.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm thinking about you repeatedly use the word material in the literature, and you also introduce yourself as of the material culture. I'm thinking about computers. When we think about computers, it's like symbolic or spiritual, and at least we say it's spiritual, right? After the very initial heavy lifting machine for the computers are kind of considered as spiritual. So why do you use this computer to establish like the relationship between computer and human labor?
Yeah, thank you so much. I like this, like, we don't talk about it as symbolic or spiritual, but at most virtual. Gosh, so much to say about material and material culture, and how in fact I don't identify with that term very much, but I do think that, so part of, you know, what feels undeniable to me when I think about 80s computers, or if you go and you visit like a computer technology museum now, which is, it's much easier to think about those devices as material now, because the distance from who held up their phone? Dahlia, you held up your phone. The distance from that to whatever, any of these devices feels kind of immense. And so, and going back further to the mainframe, you're just sort of overwhelmed by the materiality. But just to go anecdotal for a second, I remember when we had our first PC brought home in the 80s, and some of you might have a similar experience or a very different one, and I'm interested in that as well. It was like, it's this thing, and you're gonna unbox it, and it's so weird looking, and it's gonna, where do we put it? Does it go in the family room? Does it go in the bedroom? Does it go in the office? I mean, there was even discussion about what it was as like a piece of furniture. Is it like a toaster? Is it like a television? There was this kind of mystery and thrall around the object itself. And so much of using a computer, it still is now. I mean, my point from the beginning is it still is deeply material, right? I mean, if you've ever complained about having a sore neck or your eyes hurt because you're looking at your device all the time, you understand the materiality of the device. But I think when in the story, so to go back to, this is not a history of computing so much as it's a kind of story about the stories we told about computing, the physicality of the device is really important. Whether it's Whopper and how Whopper looks in this movie set, which is supposed to be so impressive and so daunting, or whether it's about the kind of tinkering that the boys do with the Explorers with their literally like their dial-up modem that creates a spaceship, and how they're figuring out how do we protect the modem and ourselves in this little spacecraft with enough oxygen to go into space. That there's a real physicality that I think was still impressive and strange and new to people around the PC, that it makes its way into the stories. So even to think about a song like Computer Love by Kraftwerk, I should have queued it up. I could listen to it at a listening party with my little microphone. But even as things are, to use your word, becoming virtual in the sound, right? The idea is like, oh, the synth is going to be a sound that doesn't sound like an instrument played by a hand. And so there's a kind of virtualization in the sound, supposedly, right? That I think these musical artists are also thinking about the physicality of, obviously their music and the beats and all of this, but what does it sound like to press a button? Or if you've typed recently on like a Commodore 64 computer, that is the most haptic experience. It's so loud, it requires so much more force than our computers today. And so I just think the materiality and the embodiment of these things was so present that of course it makes its way into the popular culture of the time too. I hope that answers your question. Or if you want to follow up, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just probably I have because I'm younger, I have weird relationships to because I told more us the kind of policy of Apple, they didn't really repair your iPhone somewhere. They just give you a new and you kind of synchronize all your data to this new iPhone. Now it's your iPhone again, right? So they say that what I referred to was like my iPhone was all the data in iCloud instead of this kind of solid phone, right? So it's probably because, and also what you said before about the computer being a black box, right? All I can access is the file system and what I put in it, instead of the actual electronic circuits going on in that box. So this just feels more real.
I love that. No, thank you so much for that. I really love that. And I often think about how until sometime in the 2000s, like when something went wrong with my computer, I could do something about it. I would go in, there would be a prompt, and now that rainbow wheel spins and I just stand there and stare at it and I'm completely helpless, and it's not only because I made the switch to Apple, although that's a big part of it, but it's because that kind of user interface and this seamless experience where your iPhone in 50 years is still your iPhone right now, right? That we're just transferring the data all the way along. That did really change. And it was actually in talking to people who are much more adept at programming, coding, and building computers that I actually started to think about that metaphor, that imperfect metaphor that I had in the talk with the 80s computer being in some ways more like the car. that I would come home from school and there would be an open computer and 100 pieces on the floor in my house because my dad had decided he was going to upgrade some component. And there was a 30% chance that we were also just going to get a new computer after that happened, but there was a 70% chance that it was going to work. And just the idea that one would do that, like I would never, ever do that now. There's an amazing photographer, I've forgotten his name, who takes objects apart, and they're often technological objects, and then he lays out all the different pieces and he photographs them. And when you look at like what's in an iPod or a computer, I mean, it's mind-blowing, right? And I don't think I could tell you what 4 of those pieces were. So that shift where you're saying, we've arrived at this very different point. I think you're right, and I think it makes the historical distance to what I'm talking about seem even greater, which is a little scary. But it makes also the artifacts more interesting to me, at least.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk, and I had a question about what it means to do kind of a history of feeling, and also, I mean, your ambivalent remarks about nostalgia, for example, the way that feeling is feeling now and feeling then, and how the feelings change, and also the relation, whether this feeling is really what's inflected in your title. Is it really feeling the computer, or is it the love that's being kind of missed or being recovered in your work? And you mentioned also in response to a question, the mood is easy to get out of the message. Marcos, you said something like this, and I guess it also comes back to Zai's question about critique. You made this interesting point about overcoming or combating patriarchal structures. It's not only through things like critique, but also through things like pleasure. And there were a few times when you really insisted on that. So that I think it was like feel the love, so this is authentic. And then the innocence, the computational innocence is sincere. And I wonder about that gesture of insisting on this sort of purity of these feelings, and then at the same time, you acknowledge that they are also the base, potentially or in some relation to evading the history of the 80s, evading the war of drugs, the AIDS crisis, and so on and so forth. And I wonder I wonder if you're really keeping these so far apart. And what about the pleasure and the evasion being much closer together?
Yeah, that's a great question with a lot of different pieces, and also just a kind of helpful reminder of something that I should think more about, or a helpful, not reminder, point about what I should think more about. Let me, because there are a few different pieces here, let me just start with the point about pleasure. Because I suppose part of what I mean by that, to get away from computers and 80s and all of this, is that I'm thinking right now, many of you have probably been watching scenes from the Rutgers strike that are happening right now, right? And the labor strike. And you know, a lot of these videos are being posted on Twitter or on other social media, and they have sort of taglines like, look at the utter euphoria of this collective movement. And no one wants to say that being underpaid and exploited is what's pleasurable. But it is true that so much change and so much difference is made in the world, not only through pain and suffering, but because there is pleasure in the things and in the movements and in the collectivities and in the experiences that get brought together in service of that change. And I don't want to just be like a Pollyanna about it, but it's interesting to me that we very rarely talk about those things. That it seems to be, especially maybe in this moment, the thing we're not allowed to talk about, right? Like this is bad, this is evil, this needs overturning, this is messed up, etc. And we don't usually tether that kind of critique to what is the kind of love, what is the pleasure, what is the hope, what is the optimism, what is the solidarity, what is the collectivity that makes that, you know, makes us fight the fights and makes things move along. I think that on the ground, you know, and in activist circles that gets talked about more, but for many of us in the humanities, like we turn to literature or art or the study of literature and art because we see in there the pleasure and the beauty that happens with critique, right? That's some very broad strokes painting I'm doing here, but I just wanted to sort of elaborate on that point that you turned back to. But okay, the mood versus the message. And I was just listening to you and thinking seriously that, right, is it my mood? Like, is it ahistorical, right? When I say it's easy to figure out what the mood is, even if it's not always as easy to figure out what the message of a film is. And I'm sort of wondering now if that's, you know, my own bias, that I watch these movies with a kind of mood or with my own kind of nostalgia. And so, in fact, part of what I take to be your question is that it's really hard to access like the feelings or the mood of historical subjects. And that said, I do think that as a literary scholar, you know, part of what I am trained to do and do with more or less success is to think about what mood a work is meant to cultivate in a reader or in a viewer. And I just think that even if there is nostalgia here, or even if there is a kind of an ahistoricity to me as a viewer watching this now, that these movies are cued to a certain mood and to produce a certain mood. And I think that the sort of last part of your question might be to say, well, yeah, but isn't a happy ending also potentially not sincere, right? It's like a marketing ploy. It's a feel-good thing, or it's meant to, just like Charlie Chaplin's Tramp is meant to sell a computer, why wouldn't this be meant to sell a movie? And I think all those things are true as well. It gets a little bit back to Greg's question and the messy ambivalence maybe of all of these texts, but I would still say that if you looked at, if you just did if it was possible to do like a snapshot of what are people saying about computers in popular culture right now? And what are they saying about computers in popular culture in 1986? It would be very clear that there really is a different mood around them. I mean, I would stand by that point as unempirical as it is, I suppose.
Do you have a theory of when the tilt happens?
Something to do with Apple.
Like gateway.
Remember
those cow
the Dell, yeah. You know, I don't know. I haven't, so it's funny because part of what I've had to do to get this project even off the ground is to narrow it down to a project about the 80s, but there's like another project to be done about the 90s or the early aughts. And my sense is, and maybe some of you have I would love to hear your theory of when the tilt is. So it is the closed architecture, first of all, around the computers. There's no more tinkering energy. It's like top down. And then you suddenly don't have tinkerers, you have hackers. And it's like, oh, isn't that like nefarious? And why is that, right? And it has a lot to do, I think, with the decision, who made that decision, but the decision that these were not going to be like individual artifacts or personal computers, no more P in the PC, right? And that it was going to be kind of corporate control, corporate product. But I also think that there's a big transition. I mean, first of all, from like the dial-up modem to other forms of connecting to the internet, and then the infinite scaling down of the computers. I mean, once you get to a handheld a handheld computer, smartphone, then we're in a very, very different moment, not just expressed by what people are doing with their devices, but what the stories are about the devices. It's funny because when I was talking about this with a friend, she was saying, we didn't call them devices in the 80s. And we were like, yeah, what did we call them? They were machines. And I would be interested. So what I haven't done is, for instance, like an etymological or the n-gram search to figure out when do we start saying device instead of machine about the computer. I think it's actually kind of late, you know?
Yeah, there are two questions. Go ahead. In the back.
Thank you so much for stuff. Next question, actually more about love, about computers. But I wonder if, in your perspective, you assume a gap between the human and the non-human for computer love to emerge. Because we all know the omnipresent narratives about the blurring boundaries between humans and non-humans, not only the many study modules. So I was wondering how these, what extent these perspectives affect your perception of computer love.
I love this question. You're the guy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for coming. Okay, the short answer. Okay, so the short answer would be like, yes, there's a gap. But what I would say about that is whether or not I believe in post-human love, or I believe that my cats feel something like love, or I believe that the trees love one another, whether or not I believe it, the texts from the 80s are like, there are humans and there are computers, and the computers might sort of become human, but in fact, no, never, not really. And they might counsel us to be better at love, but with one huge caveat, and it actually goes back to the material question that was asked before, which is, because if you've seen Electric Dreams, it's like a classic one, no matter how much that computer may or may not feel something like love, it is like trapped in a device, and it is much more like a toaster, and the stories are really adamant that there are just non-human limitations to love that a computer may or may not feel. And that's, I would say Electric Dreams is even, and Weird Science a little bit, they're even like the furthest on the spectrum of computers feeling love or loving one another. But the divide is still, I think, pretty rigid, which is interesting even in the, even in thinking about the fantasies and fictions about sentient computers in the 80s. And part of what those films, in particular, I'm thinking about those two, insist is like, humans may be very bumbling and bad at love, but computers are even worse, and we'll never get to where we are. I feel like there was another part of your question that was really interesting to me though about love. What was the beginning? Was there something else at the beginning? Maybe it'll come back to me.
Blurring boundaries.
Blurring of boundaries, yeah. Yeah, I mean, basically I would just say, oh, that's what I wanted to say, just as a kind of, I'm not going to do the full rant, but I do think that it's so important that we don't like have humans as like the top of the food chain of everything that we ever talk about. But I do think that in scholarship there has been a tendency in the very well-meaning interest of like divesting the human of some of its power, and the way that we seem to have no regard for the environment or animals or plants or anything else, to insist that you know, objects have agency, but like the trash bags aren't going to pick themselves up out of the Pacific garbage patch, right? So this is just to say that I'm sort of always skeptical, even though I think we need to de-hierarchize. I'm sort of skeptical of the move, the critical or scholarly move, at least, to say, well, surely the computer can feel like a human. It's a conservative impulse, maybe, but.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Referring to feelings, I was thinking about, you talked about your own experience with the Barbie game, which I thought was really interesting. I was thinking about what feeling we're trying to emulate here and to retrieve when we're playing these games. And I was thinking about this pleasure and anonymity, or at least this pleasure of being outside of yourself. When you play, you have a username, or you play a 1 and 2. You're not playing with your friend, your sibling, you're players, anonymous players. And I was thinking about, outside of the context of the 80s, about this notion of anonymity that becomes problematic too, with haters, trolls, that have this power of being anonymous. And yeah, I feel like it comes back to this very primitive feeling of being outside of yourself, and it's also present in child playing. When you're playing, who are you? Are you the policeman? Are you the cowboy? And what would you say about this feeling of anonymity?
Yeah, that's great. The pleasure in anonymity. And I think, to go back to Zakir's question, like, when did the tilt happen? These aren't network games, right? So I'm playing, or I was playing as Barbie, and that's just me. There's no one else involved. I mean, Ken, in my whatever-year-old imagination, was involved, but there was no other human. But I feel like what you're talking about, this will seem maybe like a tangent. Do you remember when Second Life was going to be the next big thing? And I was so baffled, people are like, what's that? This is maybe not the best way to answer the question. But so Second Life sold itself, it was like a virtual online environment, and you would, create an avatar. And the way that, what? It's a meta, it's the metaverse. Yeah, so good. This is all gonna come together, not be a tangent at all. So the way Second Life advertised itself was like, come online and be anything you want. And your avatar, you could have been like a fishbowl with a tuna fish body on roller skates. Did anyone do that? No. People went into Second Life and for the most part made a version of themselves. Some people did experiment with other sort of, traits or genders and all these different things. But for the most part, it was like, hi, now I'm in Second Life and now I'm not, now I'm 5'8" and perpetually 23 years old or whatever. But people were not imaginative, is my point. And then the even more mind-boggling thing to me, and if you're into Adorno, this is like, straight Adorno, but like people like built their job and their home and they just replicated their life. So it was literally Second Life. And they were like, now I go to work and then I come home and now I have to do laundry and I'm gonna hang out with my neighbors. And like, ooh, the craziest thing that was happening was like a sex party with an avatar, that you didn't know. But there was this interesting moment for me around Second Life where it was like, instead of leaning into what I think you're saying is pleasurable about these games, and I agree is pleasurable about these games, in addition to the kind of simplicity of the technology. Like when we hear that 8-bit, Nintendo music, like money, we love it because it's simpler, it's childlike, it evokes our own childhood. But what you're talking about is like, we even forgot and still forget to lean into the anonymity, except when it comes to the negative stuff that happens online. We use that kind of anonymity to protect ourselves when we want to behave badly. And it does feel like Second Life for me is an interesting case study along the way of what was happening with the pleasure and the imagination of how we play, and how that pleasure, in some ways, I think there are spaces where it still happens and many that I probably don't even know about, but it does feel like it's become very impoverished. CF metaverse.
Thank you for this talk. First off, I really enjoyed it. I'm going to preface this by saying that I was born in 2004, so I'm entering this space with a very specific set of experiences, but
Great.
I'm interested to know more about why or how you think we've fallen out of love with computing. So I agree that we've largely fallen out of love with hardware, like PC building in the gaming community, but I think maybe we've fallen out of love with hardware or the portal, you could say, but I actually disagree with the notion that we've fallen out of love with computers in general or with the software. I think if anything, the anarchy of the worlds to which we travel through these portals has become like way more tangible, and that's almost, in my opinion, replaced the hardware, and it's sort of made data storage and transference itself more of the computer than the actual box that we think of. So I'm thinking about that sense of digital anarchy as something to fall in love with in and of itself. So my question is, if we have gradually moved our conceptions of computing away from the mere technological and towards the immaterial and the virtual, on what basis has computer love died when so many people my age are like really enamored with digital avatars in our environments?
Yeah, this relates to, I'm sorry I don't know your name, but the question too about the immaterial data. And you've asked a lot of different things there. So I'm gonna try to be short because I know we're short on time. So I would say, first of all, falling in love with digital anarchy, yes, this sounds like the greatest thing, and I want to know more about it. But I do think you actually, in your question, sort of answered part of your question, which is, you said, we're seeing this as a portal, right? And I think that that's really different than, I mean, the reason why this is called computer love and not like internet love or portal love or even platform love or connectivity love is because, to go back to that kind of device or machine specificity, and that I am interested precisely in the fact that we did love the device and we did love the hardware, and it allowed us to have certain stories about that love, to orient our homes and our bodies in a different way. And I think that it's interesting to me to hear you say, like, we're really in love with these digital avatars. And you probably have very specific examples in mind that I think probably substantiate exactly what you're talking about. But I think that for so many people, and I don't just mean my age, I mean, when I think about my students, part of what they bemoan is precisely what, is it Nina was talking about? Which is they're like, my avatar, basically, there may be spaces or subcultures online where I get to go and be, you know, an anarchist subject or a cipher or all these different things, but they're also constantly under the pressure to perform themselves or better than themselves in digital spaces. That's Instagram, that's TikTok, that's, you know, all of these media where there's this heightened pressure to curate the self and not the anonymous self and not the anarchist self, but the corporatized neoliberal high performing self. And so maybe what you're talking about, in addition to not being about the physical device that I'm really interested in or the material culture that I'm really interested in, is also really a question or an important road sign, if you will, toward maybe what is a really complex terrain around digital anonymity. And that the popular, I mean, that public discourse, I mean, I don't hear when I listen to podcasts or read the newspapers, like I don't hear them talking about what you're talking about. And there's probably very good reason for that, but it is also then a kind of worthy subject to me of inquiry, because it's like, well, if all we're hearing about are the negative pressures of cultivating a non-anonymous self online, what are these other spaces and why don't we hear about them if that's where the love is, right? So thank you for pointing that out.
And thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful talk.